It was once a ro'eh, a shepherd, who was tending his sheep in the forest. Matzah gur echad shel zeh. He found a little baby wolf. Baby wolves are cute. Baby wolves are cute. And he saw that he was, of course, without a mother. Nechamal alav, he had pity on him. After all, Jews have pity on everybody. Wolves. And he nursed him. He took a goat and he nursed him from the goat. Babam Nachto, his employer, came and he saw this and he said, "What, are you crazy? Arogoto, kill him. Shelot tiyeh takala batson. Otherwise there will be tragedy with the sheep." And he didn't listen to him because, after all, the shepherds named Michael Lerner know better. After all, we have to have pity upon wolves. Ivan Shegadal, when the wolf grew up, Keves, Nago, he used to see a sheep and killed it. Gidi, a goat, and ate it up. Amalo Balabayit, so the employee said to him, Lo amalti lecha, lo tachos, didn't I tell you not to have pity? Kach amar lehem Moshe, similarly did Moses say, Imatem chasim alehem, if you have pity upon them, vayasher totiru mehem, those that you shall leave, will be l'sikim benechem, as thorns in your eyes. That is Judaism. That is Judaism. He speaks of mercy. And indeed, Judaism is filled with mercy. Rachmanut, mercy is one of the attributes of the Almighty. And it is indeed one of the attributes of the Jewish people. We are known as Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim. Merciful, the children are merciful. But, the rabbis tell us, on that same verse, lo tachos incha lehem, don't have pity on them, they said. So the Ramban says there are two kinds of mercy. There is Rachmanut, which is mercy, which is good. And then there's Rachmanut shel tipshim, the mercy of fools, the mercy of imbeciles, the mercy of which the rabbis speak when they say, Kol hamrachem al ha'achzar, sofo liot achzar al ha'rachman. One who has mercy upon the cruel will someday bring cruelty upon the merciful. The Torah brings down, Mr. Lerner, the Torah brings down an interesting commandment. If we find the body of a murdered Jew, and we do not know who the murderer is, we measure to the nearest town, nearest city. And then the elders of that city must come out to the spot and they have to proclaim publicly, Yadeinu lo shafchu et adam hazeh. Our hands did not shed this blood. And the rabbis of the Talmud asked, did anyone then suspect them? The rabbis, the elders. Who suspected them? But they have to make a declaration, we didn't do it. And reply, that's not what the point is. Of course they didn't do the actual killing. But they have to proclaim, we did everything possible to ensure that he would not be killed. Can this pitiful creature say that? A man who calls for mercy upon cruel people, upon people who, if they could, would bring upon us a holocaust of hatchets and knives. The blood of every Jew who has been murdered in Israel is upon the heads of every foolish Jew who said, shouldn't throw the Arabs out, it's not moral, and so they remain and murder Jews. The mercy of fools, and one of the greatest does not sit there. In August 24th, 1929, there were no occupied territories in 1967. And on August 24th, 1929, the Arabs in Hebron massacred 67 Jews in one day. Now, I never knew why, until I was enlightened by people such as the missing one. I never knew what was bothering the Arabs in 1929, until I realized it was their anger over the fact that the Jews did not give up the occupied lands of 1967. Between 1936 and 1938, there were 3 years of an intifada. And 510 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered during that period. What was bothering our Ishmaelite cousins in 1936? I never realized until Michael Lerner enlightened me. If only we had given up the occupied lands of 1967, nothing would have happened to us in 1936. And in 1947, when the United Nations proposed a partition plan which might have created a Jewish state and one Palestine, they said no. And they went to war. And 6,000 Jews died in that war. Fully 1% of the population. What was bothering them in 1947? Clearly, it was Jewish obstinacy, stubbornness, and fascism in refusing to give up the lands of 1967. And in 1967, who had the occupied lands of 1967? Certainly not Tikkun magazine. The Arabs had it. We went to war. It does not take great genius to know that if someone has East Jerusalem and he goes to war, it might be because he wants West Jerusalem and West Tel Aviv and West Israel. And this pitiful creature who in 1967 was running around with a bandana attacking Israel as an imperialist state, a tool of capitalism. This pitiful, overgrown ignoramus today sits in the Bay Area and tells me to gamble on peace. And if we lose the gamble, who will suffer, Michael? We who live there, Michael, not you who live on the bay. The tragedy of Israel is that there is no Arab problem. There is only a Jewish one. Were we Jews normal, there would be no Intifada, no Palestinian problem. But the abnormality of our times is mirrored in this. He's hardly the only madman. Let me read to you several news items that appeared within the past year. Believe me, a mere handful of a great collection which could go into a book called Cuckoo Land. This is a Jewish telegraphic agency news item that appeared on June 3rd, 1989. The police will prohibit the waving of Israeli flags in the Old City next week during marches and rallies marking Jerusalem Day. The ban is intended to avoid disturbances by the Arab population. This is sheer hell. One cannot really believe this. This is Lernerism at its best. On Jerusalem Day, to commemorate the liberation of the Old City, Jews will not be permitted to wave Israeli flags lest the Arabs will be upset and disturbed. Clearly, it is the waving of the Israeli flags that disturbs the Arabs, nothing else. Nothing else. If only we won't wave the flags, then they will love us. Ah, I tell you, it is a pleasure to live in Cuckoo Land. The following letter appeared in the Jerusalem Post on June 2nd, 1989. It's written by a non-Jew named Wilbur Cartwright from Tempe, Arizona. And it reads in part as follows. While visiting the Temple Mount, I was moved to recite from the Book of Psalms, which I always carry. I'll avoid that Teddy Kollek should always carry the Book of Psalms, or Michael, but what can we do? An Arab official and policeman rushed over to me and emphatically demanded that I stop praying. I asked why, and they explained that Jews are not permitted to pray on the Mount. However, when I informed them that I was Christian, they withdrew their opposition and permitted me to continue. I could not believe my eyes or ears. Are Jews forbidden to pray on the site of the temple which King Solomon built and from which he prayed? I am still in a state of shock. Well, I'm shocked too. I'm shocked that he's shocked. Such has been the Greek comedy tragedy since 2 weeks after the Six-Day War. And for those of you who are old enough to recall that, I remember that glorious, that divine, that historic moment when the Israeli troops liberated the Temple Mount. And I recall listening to the recording of the commander of the forces, Mota Gur. He is a laborite, he's a leftist, a sect. But even he was caught up in that moment, and you could hear his voice shaking with emotion as he shouted over his walkie-talkie, Har HaBayit B'Yadeinu, Har HaBayit B'Yadeinu, the Temple Mount is in our hands. In our hands. 2 weeks later, we gave the key to the Mufti, the Waqf, the Muslim Supreme Council, and today, if you're a Christian, pray a Muslim, you can pray a Jew, you can take pictures. What the Chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name by people afflicted with the disease of learnerism. This appeared last year, February 24th, 1989. Headline: Parents fear to send children on school trips to Jerusalem. Now, when I founded the Jewish Defense League in Brooklyn, it was because people were afraid to send their children out. Jews were afraid. And then I went to Israel, and guess what I found? I found Brooklyn. Parents fear to send children on school trips to Jews. Jews are afraid today to walk to the Kotel, the Western Wall, through the Arab Shuk, through Shar Shechem, Damascus gates. For 1900 years we had a dream. We lived in exile, in a ghetto, in degradation. We lived in fear, we lived in terror, and we dreamed a dream of Shivat Zion, the return to Zion, that someday we would come back to our own land and there live proud and free and unafraid. No. Today we have a state. Parents fear to send children on school trips to Jerusalem. What a tragedy. I received a letter last August from an elderly Jew, a survivor of the Holocaust, who lives in Haifa. And with it he sent me a copy of an article that appeared in the local Haifa weekly, Kolbo. Rehov Hillel Street in Haifa. Idbach al Yahud, which is Arabic for slaughter the Jew, the Emsa Yom in the middle of the day. And it tells a story how Arabs in Haifa, not Shechem, in Haifa, are terrorizing Jews. And he gives me the address of one particular Arab, Rehov Hillel al Mishmon Aleph, 48 Aleph Hillel Street, in Haifa. And then he writes me, and I'll